It's a collision of two processions, one of life and another of death. In this direction, Jesus leading a procession. Jesus, fresh off the preaching of the Sermon on the Plain, now the miracle of the healing of the centurion's slave at Capernaum, he is surrounded by people, disciples, well-wishers, blessing seekers, everybody thronging after Jesus. It's not a procession, really. It's more boisterous than that. It's more like what happens when the home team wins the championship and the whole city's streets are filled with happy people, and they are on their way. Say what you will about Jesus, he is a wonder. And then in the other direction, it's something much more somber. It is a procession, much more carefully scripted. Tradition and experience have taught everyone the parts that they need to play, because this is a funeral procession, and a more solemn occasion even than normal, because this is a funeral procession for a young man. The young man, a son of a widow. She is now childless, functionally barren. This woman will most certainly be destitute. She has lost her only hope. His death has confirmed what her husband's death hinted at, that she would be a destitute woman, a woman without station. She is now essentially childless, barren, and there was no one considered less blessed than a barren woman in first century Palestine. What will happen when these two processions collide with one another? What will happen when life on the one hand and death on the other come into collision? Well, tradition dictates, experience certainly dictates what will be the outcome. Because we know from our own experience that death always has the final word, and certainly it was true also in Jesus' day. Tradition very explicitly said that when Jesus came into contact with this procession of mourning, he and all his revelers, happy though they may be, needed to stop and stand at the very least, but preferably join in the mourning, out of respect for the dead and love for the woman who has lost her son. They must stop their celebration, step to the side, and come in behind as the bier goes by, led by this woman whose last act of love for her son is to lead this one whom she brought into life now into a place of death. Every one of us knows that things break, that things fall apart. Every one of us knows that death always follows life, that everything, no matter how wonderful, is subject to decay. Look at this sidewalk. A bright young graduate school-bound physics student once said to me, "You know, I kind of feel torn. On the one hand, my faith calls me to live in the hope of eternity. On the other hand, I spend all of my day in the lab working with theories that depend on the fact that everything is bound to decay." The crumbling infrastructure in so many of our rural and urban communities aren't just signs of the limitations of concrete. They are signs, markers of individuals and families, neighborhoods and whole regions where processions of mourning seem to be the only way to describe a reality that is subject to death and destruction and decay. Wars and acts of terror aren't merely failures of foreign policy, but continual reminders of our apparent inability to live our lives without requiring the death simultaneously of others. Earthquakes and floods aren't just marks on a statistician's chart, but cruel reminders that we are unable to secure our lives or our futures in a dangerous world. Everybody's got their stories of decay and serial despair. You probably have yours. Even people of faith are not immune. The amazing thing about what happens in Luke's telling of this encounter between Jesus and his parade of life and this woman and her procession of death and mourning is that Jesus' parade of life does not stop. In fact, Jesus comes to this woman who is leading her dead son's bier, and he says to her, "Stop your weeping." Now, under normal circumstances, that would be a cruel thing to say. This woman's weeping at this point is all she has. The compassionate thing to do is to join her weeping. And Jesus is compassionate. But then Jesus goes beyond that. He goes over to the son's bier and he touches it and he calls out to the corpse, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And Jesus touches and places his life over this dead boy's, this dead man's corpse. And he sits up. And the explosion of joy resounds over the village. This is, in fact, the most wonderful thing that could have happened to this woman. And Jesus is at the center of the celebration. Now, why does Luke tell us this story? Well, certainly, first and foremost, it's because such things actually happened in the life and ministry of Jesus, and as such, they bear repeating. But it's more than that. And it's not just as though Jesus and his disciples were some kind of traveling band, a first century HMO, a health maintenance organization that was in its own way and in its own time trying to change the mortality statistics for widows' sons. No, the people in the community tell us why Luke tells us this story. When Jesus is there telling the young man to get up from his bier, everyone around says, "This is a wonder. God has come to visit us." What they couldn't have imagined is that this same Jesus who has this day worked such a miracle to the joy of all around and their wonder, this same Jesus will find himself rejected to the point where people want his death and finally make his death happen. What they could never have imagined is that this same Jesus who has returned this woman's son back to her will himself die, hanging on a cross. If Jesus in Nain with this young man and his widowed mother is a visit from God to us, then Jesus hanging on the cross in death and desecration, well, God doesn't seem to be doing very well. Except that Jesus knows more than his onlookers. Jesus doesn't just come to give us what we'd like, the delay of death. Jesus comes to bring us what we need, the destruction of death. Jesus on the cross of Calvary will take death on death's own territory. And his victory on Easter Sunday changes everything. It changes history. After that, nothing is the same. Now when we look at the story of the widow of Nain and her dead son come back to life, we see that this wasn't just a story of one person being brought back to life. This was a story of how in the person of Jesus, the kingdom of God really was coming. It anticipates Jesus' resurrection, but it does more than that for you and for me. If the raising of the widow's son at Nain anticipates the resurrection of Jesus and the fact that the resurrection of Jesus changes history for humanity and all of creation, then every time you in your life encounter an occasion where hope defeats despair, where life rises in the presence of death, where creativity trumps over desperation and destitution, those are reflections of the resurrection of Jesus, not replacements for it, not what we can deal with now and the center for our hope, but in fact, they are signs of the presence of the kingdom of heaven, at work also in your life. The resurrection of Jesus changes everything. And now you and I, we live and work in the full knowledge of Jesus' victory over death. We live in the presence of death and decay, not despairing, not hopeless, but aware of every new moment where life stands defiant in the midst of death and decay. Aware because we know that those are pointers back to the resurrection of Jesus and ways in which we can speak to others about the anticipation that we know in the consummation of the kingdom of heaven for all eternity. That is God come to visit us.